In this video, we'll look at the period from 1766 through the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You saw in the last video that Rockingham was a new British Prime Minister that George III had picked, and Rockingham wanted to back off from the tensions that were in the Stamp Act crisis. And Rockingham decided that he would repeal the Stamp Act, but he still wanted to let the colonists know that, the British were in charge. And so not only did he repeal the Stamp Act, but he also got Parliament to pass the Declaratory Act of 1766. And it simply asserted that the principle that Parliament had the right to legislate for colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. This indeed began to slow the American protest, and so Rockingham was successful, at least initially, in calming things down as 1766 ended. Any calm that Rockingham had helped bring on really didn't last that long. George III remained kind of unstable, and it's just suddenly decided that he was going to replace Rockingham with the new British Prime Minister, William Pitt. Pitt in this picture is kind of young, but at the time he was old, and he was increasingly growing ill. When Pitt became ill, he couldn't perform much of the duties of his office, and he sought to let his chief financial minister, Charles Townsend, run colonial policy. And Townsend, as the chief financial officer, was an ardent critic of Britain's war debt, which of course still remained. Townsend's an interesting character. He was known as Champagne Charlie because he was real flamboyant and loved parties and chasing the ladies. In the middle of 1767, Townsend got Parliament to pass the Revenue Act of 1767, which became known as the Townsend Duties, or the Townsend Tax. Townsend felt that he had to raise money some way to wipe out the debt, and growing numbers of British voters feared that if the colonists didn't pay for the debt, they would have to. Townsend tried to go back to the old idea of taxing trade, kind of like the Sugar Act, hoping that he could still say that, hey, it's not direct taxation, it's only regulating trade. But the problem was that the Townsend duties were on a larger number of items, and they include such things as tea, glass, lead, paper, and paint. And the duties or taxes were all to be paid by the importer. But the colonists weren't stupid, and they knew that the importer would simply pass along the increased cost to the consumer with higher prices. So in a sense, they would pay. And because the Townsend duty was so broad, it affected a lot more people than simply the Sugar Act, and a lot more Americans were really ticked off. To try to calm things down, Townsend also ordered a new customs service. While this would beef up security, it showed that Townsend was trying to be smart. It created a 5-man American Board of Customs Commissioners, all colonists in Boston. But the tactic didn't appease the colonists, however. Aware that they had won the Stamp Act crisis, they argued, like they had in regard to the Sugar Act before, that it really wasn't the regulation of trade, but it was a direct tax. The Townsend duties were a direct tax. Also, a provision in the Townsend duties really upset the colonists. The part of the proceeds of the duties or tax would go to paying the cost of the governor and other royal officials. And the colonists quickly realized that this, in essence, made the governor more independent of the colonial legislators. The colonists before had paid the cost of the governor, and the colonists had taxed themselves for this, so it gave the colonists some leverage over the governor. And if the Townsend duties went through, then they'd lose this leverage. As the colonists were ticked off over the Townsend duties, Townsend moved again by disbanding the New York Colonial Legislature. He clearly hoped to send a message to the other colonial assemblies. The New York Legislature had, by the way, resisted that colony's governor's dictate for the people in that state to house and feed rural troops. Since this cost money of the people, the New York Legislature had argued that it was essentially a tax. In early 1768 in Massachusetts, Samuel Adams convinced that colony's legislature to draft a circular letter that would be sent to all the other colonial legislatures. It called for a unified resistance and repeated the demand that Americans should only accept direct representation, not virtual representation. When the British found out about it, the Massachusetts governor said he and the other governors would treat the circular, quote, with the contempt it deserves, unquote. He ordered the Massachusetts legislature disbanded and encouraged the other colonial governors to do the same with their own legislatures. Now, most of these governors simply prohibited their legislatures from discussing the circular, but some disbanded them as the Massachusetts governor had recommended. The colonial Massachusetts legislature, however, still met in the face of the colonial governor's resistance, and they voted 92-17 to reaffirm the circular and not to back down. 92 became a symbolic number for the colonists, kind of like 45 had been already a bit earlier. Earlier in Britain, a publisher had been put in jail for libel by advocating the American position. The title of his essay had been The North Britain 45, so 45 had been a number that mattered to the Americans. In Boston, a man named Paul Revere made a punch bowl weighing 45 ounces that held 45 1/2 cups. Engraved on the outside were the names of the 92 Massachusetts legislators who voted to reaffirm the circular. Protests carried 95 and 45 candles, and in pubs across America, people proposed 45 and 92 toast. You really see in that many of the common people who met in pubs and drank a lot, they're starting to become more patriotic, and you can see it in these toasts. As the colonial leaders made more of a deliberate attempt to incorporate the masses, a new tactic emerged: economic pressure through non-consumption. Simply put, a boycott of British goods. Now, women played a key role in this process. There were several public women's marches, and they called themselves the Daughters of Liberty, obviously coined after the Sons of Liberty. It should be noted that women were critical to making products the colonists would need when they didn't buy British goods. Anyway, the colonists were not completely united, however, in this non-importation effort. Unlike the Stamp Act crisis earlier, the economy was booming and there was little financial incentive to join the boycott. Sometimes the merchants signed the agreement, but only reluctantly. And then many of them only signed it when they were threatened by the Sons of Liberty. Many artisans, however, who stood to gain because nonimportation would wipe out their competition from Britain, they strongly supported the agreements. Regardless, the non-importation agreements worked, and colonial imports from England dropped dramatically throughout 1769. And ultimately, this worried the British merchants who pressured George III. And George III, being unstable again, decided that he was going to shift prime ministers. And so he decided to replace William Pitt with the new British Prime Minister, Lord North. Lord North would then decide that he would repeal the Townsend Duties but retain the import tax on tea. And the colonists were overall pleased because the non-importation agreement had really begun to divide the colonists, the merchants and artisans, and sometimes even within colonies, the dispute between merchants and artisans had grown violent. But regardless, with the new prime minister, Lord North again repealed the Townsend Duties but retained the import tax on tea. You can certainly understand Lord North's desire to sort of cool tensions again because things were quickly spiraling out of hand. As late 1769 approached, the British had been stopping many American ships claiming that they were smuggling things into the colonies. One of the ships that they had stopped was owned by a patriot leader named John Hancock, and Hancock had called his boat Liberty, by the way. And anyway, the British had claimed that it was smuggling. Well, when a riot had resulted, the British had sent 2 regiments of regular British Army to keep order. And by early 1770, they were stationed in Boston, and they became to the Bostonians sort of a symbol of oppression. The British soldiers demanded passes, and they harassed people and even made sexual comments to passing American women. In addition, many of these regular troops sought employment in their off-duty hours and thereby were competing with American workers. Anyway, on March 5th, 1770, a crowd of laborers began throwing hand-packed snowballs at some of these regular British soldiers just outside the customs house in Boston, and they were probably had rocks in these snowballs. But against direct orders, the soldiers cracked and fired into the crowd, killing 4 and wounding 8, one of whom died a few days later. The colonists quickly publicized the dead as martyr, and Paul Revere made sort of an engraving of the massacre that was widely circulated as propaganda. As an interesting sidebar, one of the first people killed in the Boston Massacre was a mulatto former slave and sailor named Crispus Attuck, who had returned from sea and was arguably the first person shot. And it's a bit ironic that African American would be the first person shot when so many African Americans didn't have freedom themselves. After the Boston Massacre, a trial was to be held for the British soldiers. The trial would be in Boston and would have a jury of Americans as to decide their soldiers' fate. Deciding to defend the soldiers was the Boston lawyer John Adams, as we say, a distant cousin of Samuel Adams. And John Adams, a lot of people said, couldn't understand why would he defend these British soldiers? Well, Adams didn't want the American movement for liberty to be defined by a mob. He thought it was important for law and order to rule, and also he didn't want, if it seemed like an unfair trial, the British soldiers would become martyrs. So in the end, Adams was pretty successful. All but 2 soldiers were acquitted, and those that were convicted got light sentences, sort of just a smack on the thumbs. And thankfully, after the Boston Massacre, as I say, and the repeal of the Townsend Duties, with the exception of the Tea Act anyway, but with the most of the Townsend Duties repealed, tensions did indeed begin to calm. After the Boston Massacre, tensions remained high, but no serious violence or agitation really took place for a couple of years. It wasn't until Lord North shifted British policy again in 1772 and 1773 that real tensions exploded again. After the repeal of the Townsend Duties, many colonial legislatures had begun reasserting their right to fund the office of the royal governor, thus regaining their leverage over key British officials. Lord North, however, once again said that British government would pay these salaries, and thus that again denied the colonial leverage. Made matters even worse, the Lord North got Parliament to pass the Tea Act of 1773. This Tea Act not only increased the British tax on tea, which had been left from the Townsend Duties, but it also dramatically cut down on smuggling. The British had not adequately enforced the Tea Act under the Townsend Duties, and that's why it really hadn't been a lot of tensions. But now the Lord North is planning to really crack down on smuggling and increase the tax at the same time, so it was sure to reignite tensions. You got to understand how important tea was in colonial diets and how badly this new Tea Act bothered the colonists. The Tea Act, in addition to cracking down on smuggling and raising the tax on tea, gave tax breaks to a British company that imported tea to America, the British East India Company. Now, the idea was to give that company assistance so that it could sell its tea in America at a price lower than the smuggled tea American colonists had been bringing in. American colonists, however, believed that this was all just another way to get them to pay a higher rate and, in essence, pay the newer and greater tax on tea, and they were ticked off and they protested. In response to this new development, Samuel Adams, who now was 51 years old, and again he's 13 years older than his distant cousin John Adams, he decided to create committees of correspondence. The thought was to publicize the new British actions by exchanging letters with other Massachusetts towns. But soon committees of correspondence grew up in other colonies as well, and they were sort of designed to keep dissent alive and to sort of coordinate and expand a growing economic non-importation of British goods. The committees of correspondence made concerted and largely successful efforts to involve people in the frontier West. The committees of correspondence referred to the British soldiers, by the way, as lobsters. Americans who disagreed with these activist actions or directly spoke in support of the British were occasionally tarred and feathered. And I referenced this earlier, but a person who was tarred and feathered was stripped naked, covered in a sticky tar, and thrown into a body, throw the body into a bunch of feathers, which would stick to it. But sometimes the crowd would be cruel and then set the feathers on fire. But this did not bode well for any peace and calm. As the British collected increasing amounts of taxes, another incident really ticked people off. Late in 1772, a colonist in Rhode Island had set a British revenue ship, the Gaspé, on fire as a means of protest, and that, of course, really angered the British. As tensions grew, they sort of came to a head in December of 1773 with the famous Boston Tea Party. Across the colonies, as these committees of correspondence grew and the non-importation agreements expanded, Sons of Liberty's groups began identifying the East India Company's agents, the tea company's agents, and they would try to harass them and said that anybody that did business with them was an enemy to America. When 3 British ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in Boston in December 1773, the ship's captain wanted to return to England, but the royal governor said, no, you can't go back, and so the ship stayed in the harbor, its cargo still on board. Samuel Adams roused up a crowd, and the crowd went to the wharf where the ships were, and some 60 men dressed as Indians, which was a disguise that obviously made no effect, began to storm the boats, and a crowd of a couple thousand watched and cheered as these so-called Indians boarded the boats. And for 3 hours, they dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the harbor. The total weight was about 90,000 pounds of tea, or it was worth 10,000 sterling silver. So it was a pretty significant loss for the company. The Bostonians quickly dubbed it the Boston Tea Party, and the British were irate. So as December 1773 ended, once again, tensions were at a high point. This includes the video from that goes all the way from 1766 until 1773.